Thanks everyone for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Chip Gibbons, who's a journalist, researcher, and policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent. And he's currently working on a book on the history of FBI political surveillance for Verso Books. Chip, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. As we were discussing, I guess, in the virtual green room, I mentioned when I was in high school, I wrote an op-ed about Project Censored, which the high school newspaper tried to censor. But I prevailed. So it's been a long time coming that I fought. 20 years, actually. That was 2006. So only 18 years.
Well, we are
It's,
so glad to have you here, and you need to dig up that article.
I'm,
Um, but specifically why I asked you on today was to talk about a letter that was sent to Secretary Blinken about a month ago, August 15th, decrying the organized murder of more than 150 journalists in Gaza since October 7th of last year. That number is thought to be closer to 170 now. And as the IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, pointed out in a recent post, that averages out to about one journalist killed every 2 days. So, Chip, let's talk about that kind of targeting that we're talking about here vis-a-vis Israel murdering journalists. What can you tell us about that prompted this letter?
Sure. And let me start with some background on the letter, and then I'll hit the targeting issue. So this letter was signed by over 100 journalists, including 4 Pulitzer Prize winners. It was joined by nearly 20 news outlets and around eight press freedom groups, including the National Writers Union, Project Censored, my favorite press freedom group besides my own, of course, Freedom of the Press Foundation. And the letter was initiated by my organization, Defending Rights and Dissent, along with the Courage Foundation and Roots Action. And the letter was a reaction to a number of things. Obviously, the fact that our taxpayer money is being used to slaughter journalists in Gaza. But the backstory there is that there has been a double standard when it comes to Palestinian journalists being assassinated or murdered by Israel versus other countries. And we know that the Palestinian journalists feel very abandoned, very let down. I am not a native Arabic speaker. I'm not even a non-native Arabic speaker. I apologize for butchering any Palestinian names. It's shameful. I should be embarrassed of myself, and I am. But Wala al-Daldu, one of the more famous journalists in Gaza, told, I think it was MSNBC, we feel that we're being killed twice, once by the bombs and once by the silence. And, I had been pushing the big press freedom groups to take on the arms, call for an arms embargo, not just say, oh, we're really concerned, because, okay, we're really concerned, but should we keep sending the weapons that are used? And I also know that even when some of the bigger press freedom groups did speak out, and I applaud them for doing so, I know many of them, they're good people, they're moral people. A lot of Palestinian journalists have commented that the type of rhetoric they use around Israel isn't the same type of rhetoric they use around Russia. And of course, Russia deserves condemnations. I'm not a fan of them. But with Russia, it's horrible crimes, terrible attacks, and with Israel, it's we're feeling kind of concerned here. And that dehumanization, that double standard, has really been felt by the Palestinian journalists who feel very abandoned by their Western colleagues. And I observed a protest outside the White House Correspondents' Dinner where supporters of the Palestinian journalist who had called for a boycott of that dinner put on the ground press jackets with the names of Palestinian journalists who had been assassinated. And I watched a guy in a tuxedo and a woman in a fancy party dress step over them to get into the gala. So both breaking this boycott of called for by Palestinian journalists, as well as stepping over the names of their murdered colleagues to do so. And that was a really jarring image for me. And I'll note that, Courage Foundation and Defending Rights and Dissent worked very closely together on Julian Assange's case, as you know, and we were used to navigating the sort of internal politics of the press freedom movement, where sometimes people held back when they in their condemnations when they should have been more strident, or when there was a lack of solidarity when it was needed most. And we had that experience, and we said, this is the Julian Assange double standard on steroids, right? This is a genocide of journalists, and people aren't doing what they should be doing. So that led us to take on this issue. And you mentioned, what do we know about the targeting? It's so hard to write anything about the number of dead in Gaza, because by the time you put your story together, those numbers are out of date. I mean, we published a piece of The Nation on this effort. It was written like 2 days before it went to print. And, we said almost 40,000, I think, had died. And by the time it went to print, 40,000 had died. And I did a number of pieces for Kevin Gostola's newsletter, The Dissenter. And I would have to go back and re-edit and re-edit and re-edit, because the number of dead just dramatically escalated every hour, every day. So at the time the letter went out, at least 160 journalists in Palestine were killed. It's been a month, so it's probably an even higher number. And the question always, sort of comes out, why so many journalists were killed? If you look at other conflicts, right, by comparison, in all of World War II, 69 journalists were killed, and 63 journalists were killed during the Vietnam War. So this is more journalists killed in any conflict in history. And, why are so many journalists being killed? One answer is the overwhelming violence that Israel is inflicting on Gaza. This, I think it's fair to call it a genocide. I've covered the ICJ hearings for Jacobin. I don't use the phrase genocide lightly. I'm not one of those activists where every time there's a war I don't like, I say, oh, it's a genocide. I try to be precise about language that has legal terms. But having sat through the ICJ hearings, having read the briefs, and just having eyes and ears, I'm very persuaded that we've reached the threshold of genocide a long time ago. And the level of violence is just massive. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. They're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on them. You see these airstrikes where 200 people are killed at once. And one of the things that struck me the most at the most recent ICJ hearing, where South Africa was asking for additional protective measures in Rafah, and I read this in the brief, I had to reread it 5 times ago, was that, a year ago, Rafah was home to 275,000 Palestinians. Presently, there are 1.5 million people in Rafah. This influx is caused by Israel's orders to evacuate people to Rafah, and the fact that the rest of Gaza has been reduced to rubble. And if you pack 1.5 million people into an area that usually only has a little bit less than 300,000, and you drop bombs on it, you drop 2,000-pound bombs on people's tents, you're going to kill a lot of people. But the killing of journalists isn't just because of this massive genocidal bombardment that Israel is engaged in. There is strong, strong evidence to believe that journalists are being deliberately targeted. So the Palestinian, I want to get the name right, the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate submitted an amicus brief in a U.S. lawsuit against Blinken, asking to enforce the Genocide Convention and ending U.S. support for Israel. It's a very interesting thing trying to do that in a U.S. court. And the original trial judge basically found there was evidence that that the U.S. was breaking the Genocide Convention, but that's a political question, not a judicial one. And they submitted this brief. It's obviously dramatically out of date, but they said that as of December 19th, 2023, 8% of journalists in Gaza had been killed. 8% of all journalists. And this is when they had only killed 95 journalists, as opposed to 160, and now maybe 170. And they wrote, Evidence strongly indicates the vast majority of journalists and media workers killed since the start of the genocide were specifically targeted by the Israeli military, according to information collected by the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. Their killing appears deliberate rather than incidental or collateral. At least 84 of the 95 deceased journalists were killed in surgical or sniper Israeli attacks that targeted their homes or personal vehicles, or the area where they were reporting. Many of these journalists received direct and specific threats to their lives from the Israeli military before they were targeted. And of course, dozens of family members have been killed in attacks on journalists. And then another thing I'm going to cite, I don't want to keep reading block quotes at you. I know that's not the most compelling thing, but 5 United Nations special rapporteurs joined together to declare, we have received disturbing reports that despite being clearly identifiable in jackets and helmets marked press, traveling in well-marked press vehicles, journalists have come under attack, which would seem to indicate that the killings, injury, and detention are a deliberate strategy by Israeli forces to obstruct the media and silence critical reporting. And of course, we've seen this in real time when, in the middle of this effort, Ismail al-Ghul was assassinated by Israel. And I remember where I was when I learned about this. Israel had been on this sort of international assassination spree. They killed the head of the Hamas political bureau, who was also the negotiator. They did some attacks in, I believe, on some other countries as well. I'm blanking on the timeline here at this moment, but it felt like we were on the verge of regional war. So I was watching Al Jazeera, and they came in breaking news. And, if brink of regional war, and we're cutting into everything for breaking news, you're just terrified. And it was that Israel had just assassinated Ismail al-Ghul. He was reporting from the refugee camp where the Hamas political bureau chief had lived previously. He had gone into exile since then. And, while reporting, there was a military strike on a nearby house. They were ordered to leave. I'm not entirely sure if it was by Al Jazeera or by the Israeli military. And then, wearing blue press vest, him and his cameraman got in a car that clearly identified them as press. Israel launched a missile strike on the car, killing both men. And I saw those photos of Al Jazeera, of Al Ghul's headless body, still wearing the blue press vest, and blood everywhere. And I saw his colleagues come on, and they were on the verge of tears. They didn't know how many more of their colleagues they could take watching being slaughtered. And then a day or two later, the official account, one of Israel's official media accounts, tweet out that he's been eliminated. All capital letters. Because Israel murders a lot of people, and they don't always take credit for it. Like, oh, we don't know who's shooting missiles from the sky in Gaza, where only one party has missiles from the sky they can shoot. And they announced that this well-respected journalist was eliminated. And they made up this story that, well, he was teaching Hamas how to film things, which there's no evidence of. He was in an elite Hamas military unit where he taught them to film their attacks. And because of that, he was eliminated, all capital letters. So the world saw a Palestinian journalist with his head blown off in a blue press vest, in a press car, blood everywhere. And the Israeli government tweeted out, eliminated, all caps, boastfully. And that is just such a sick moment for me. And of course, this isn't new. Shireen Abu Akleh was clearly murdered by the Israelis earlier in the West Bank. Snipers attacked journalists during the Palestinian March of Return. But this time, there is this sort of added urgency here. The scale is so much greater, but the situation is also more jarring because Israel is attempting to impose a complete media blackout on Gaza. They impose military censorship on their own journalists and international reporters reporting from Israel. So the New York Times bureau is based in, I believe, Jerusalem. And as a result, stories that go through that bureau have to comply with Israel military censorship. Only democracy in the Middle East, but they have all this military censorship. Israel with Egypt have blocked all foreign journalists from Gaza. They shut down the Al Jazeera office. They raided its office. They seized its equipment. They blocked its broadcast and website within Israel. So the only people on the ground in Gaza showing the world what is happening is the Palestinian journalist of Gaza. And why does that matter? I mean, again, let me go back to some of the stuff I've heard while reporting on the ICJ hearings for Jacobin. I mean, the South African government has presented the story of the discovery of mass graves outside the Al Nasser and Al Shifa hospitals. At Al Nasser, 324 bodies were unearthed, including decapitated bodies of medical workers still in their blue scrubs. We've got a journalist in his blue press vest decapitated. We've got doctors in their scrubs decapitated, thrown in a mass grave. Many of the decomposing bodies found were stripped and handcuffed. And outside the Al Shifa hospital, the bodies of women and children who appeared to have been tortured and summarily executed were discovered in 2 mass graves. And of course, there's the fact that the Gaza medical system has invented this horrible acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. So this is what they're hiding from the world. This is what they don't want us to see. And because of that, they've blocked the media, the Western media or the international media from coming in, and they're murdering the people on the ground who are reporting this because they don't want us to see the images of mass graves with doctors in handcuffs in their scrubs, of women and children tortured and shot point blank range at execution style, because this is not a defensive war. This is a plot to exterminate an indigenous population by a colonial settler apartheid state. And, the other thing about killing Palestinian journalists is that Israel just doesn't want there to be any acknowledgement that Palestinians exist, of Palestinian life. So by targeting the journalists, targeting the cultural workers, targeting the writers who just write about the Palestinian experience, that's part of the genocide, of wiping this people's memory from the earth. I know the Gaza city had a sister city in Spain, and very early on in the genocide, they sent them this just tear wrenching communique, being like, please tell the people of the future there was once a people called Palestinians, because we don't know if there will be. And this is dark.
Yeah, it is very dark, and I mean, it has to be. Genocides are not typically light fare, and
No,
I appreciate you giving that that context and that detailed information. I think it's really important that we hear it and that we not turn away from it, because we as children of empire have an obligation and an opportunity to do something about it. And I want to.
I mean, I
Sorry.
watched Al Jazeera. It's hard not to. I watched Al Jazeera like 6 hours a day for the first couple of months, and at this point, I mean, if someone was paying attention, it is so hard now that they're invading the West Bank. I mean, it's just and I've worked on this issue since 2007, and it's just this is it. This is all these years of activists, all these years of meeting great people, all these years of I think, growing victories, and now we're at, the full-scale extermination of Gaza.
Mm-hmm. And I want to hold a mirror up to the U.S., which is what you do so well, and not just the double standard that you talked about, like whether that's Russia or what have you, but the U.S. assertion that the First Amendment and the press freedom is so important, and when adding insult to murder, you basically have what amounts to a total media blackout on any of this powerful reporting that these frontline journalists are doing. Can you talk a little bit about that remarkably stark and morbid hypocrisy?
Yeah, so let me pull up a quote from the letter we sent. We mentioned to Secretary Blinken, on World Press Freedom Day this year, you called on every nation to do more to protect journalists and reiterated your unwavering support for free and independent media around the world. The U.S. government, under the Biden administration, has tried to make press freedom one of the points they champion. This is clearly not about protecting press freedom, which I support, but to sort of poke a stick at countries they don't like, Russia, which has a terrible record on press freedom, Iran, bad records on press freedom. I'm not defending those governments' records, but the US doesn't care about press freedom. They care about scoring propaganda points against governments they wish to regime change. And it doesn't make those governments good. It just makes the US quite hypocritical. And at the same time, Blinken and Biden are giving all of these grotesque words. Up until fairly recently, they were trying to put Julian Assange in jail. That's you're very familiar with my views on that. And they've done nothing. First about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was a U.S. citizen, and now are sitting by and doing nothing about these killings of journalists. And the thing about it is the U.S. is the largest armor or weapons provider to Israel. The US has an obligation to impose an arms embargo on Israel for any number of reasons, including the fact that they're engaged in a genocide, including the fact that they engage in strikes that are illegal under the Geneva Conventions, but also because they're killing journalists. And as the letter says, you cannot say, Mr. Blinken, you believe in press freedom when you give someone the weapons they use to murder journalists. And not just anyone, but the largest killer of journalists in the world today, and possibly the largest killer of journalists in human history. So one of the things this letter wanted to do was to make clear that an armed embargo on Israel is a press freedom issue. No more mealy-mouthed condemnations of, well, I wish the U.S. would express more concern, or maybe the U.S. could have an investigation. Say, no, the U.S. and Blinken gives them bombs, gives them guns, gives them diplomatic support, vetoes resolutions at the UN, and Israel uses that to deliberately target, massacre, slaughter, and assassinate journalists. And if you want to save press freedom, then you have to stop the flow of arms.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you pointed out very well, Israel could not do what it does without the support of the U.S. The U.S. it basically took the role of England and is the makes it possible for Israel to even exist, much less perpetuate a genocide. And I want to get into something that is a little bit tricky because again, like the numbers, it's so hard to even know. But I think something that I think is worth noting is that this is the first genocide in the world that's really been like live streamed in real time. And I think something that doesn't get talked about a lot is also like the citizen journalists. And it's something that is close to my heart because I started out as a citizen journalist. I didn't go to a school or anything like that. I didn't get hired by CNN or anything. And I'm curious then, like, how do the numbers work? Like, how do people count journalists? Like, what counts as a journalist in these numbers? And what does that say then about like the actual number of journalists on the front line that have actually been killed?
So the number of journalists killed is not a number everyone agrees on. Some groups have extremely conservative estimates. Some groups have less conservative estimates. We, in our letter, used the numbers from the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. They are the body that represents Palestinian journalists in the occupied territories, and I trust their numbers. The Gaza Ministry of Information has a slightly higher number than them. Surprise, surprise. The Western NGOs all have lower numbers somehow. And there is a dispute. I mean, the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate says journalists and media workers, and we use those numbers. I'm fine with those numbers. How you document it? I mean, there's a big fight about, how do you calculate these numbers? I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian journalist, so I'm going with the numbers the Palestinian journalists go with.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. And I'm also curious now that the letter has been sent. It's been about a month as of the recording of this interview. Has there been a response, not just from the power that be, but also from other organizations that weren't actual signees of the letter?
Since the letter went out, the National Writers Union asked if they could be added to it retroactively, and we told them yes. And I'm really excited to have the National Writers Union support on the letter. There has been a lot of positive statements from sort of people that were sort of moving away from the hypocrisy here, and it was a splashy thing. The corporate media, of course, ignored it. We have 4 Pulitzer Prize winners on this letter. And, you wouldn't even know what happened if you read the New York Times. But of course, Project Censored, Democracy Now!, The Nation, Common Dreams, all the places you go to actually get real news. The Real News Network also, covered it as well and signed on to it. I wasn't trying to do that segue, but I did. So, and there was a lot of, I think, interest in social media because the State Department tweeted out something about press freedom, and like hundreds or thousands of people tweeted at them about the letter. People have no idea who they are. It was not a coordinated campaign. It was organic. So I'm glad to see it have that kind of impact. We demanded a meeting with the State Department. We have yet to get it. They haven't formally denied the meeting. They just keep coming back with, oh, everyone's out of town this week, or, oh, someone's, I don't know, just stuff like that. And we sent it to every office in Congress. One office in Congress shared it, Representative Rashida Tlaib, which is, it's so fascinating because I know a lot of, younger Palestinian activists are like, I can't believe the only person who speaks up for us is one person, Tlaib. But as someone who's been doing this since 2007, it's like, oh my God, we got a single member of Congress not willing to say this. Like, do you remember, like back in the day, like not even like Dennis Kucinich or Ron Paul would do stuff like this. And now we've got Tlaib, Bush, Omar is usually good on this. And both Representative Tlaib and Representative Bush joined us for a vigil outside the Congress, honoring the journalist who died in Gaza earlier this year. It was very, very, very cold. It was snow on the ground, and no one else came, but we stood out there together. A couple of Al Jazeera journalists who weren't allowed to formally take part in it but could attend. Tlaib, Bush, Freedom of the Press Foundation, Defending Rights and Dissent, standing out in the snow, honoring these people, and that was a powerful moment. So I think it's an important moment. I do want to try to normalize more that the press freedom groups need to attack the military aid. And I do want to try to get more journalists to speak out on their colleagues being slaughtered, because I know they feel very left behind. Obviously, the 113 journalists on this letter are probably my favorite journalists, some of the best journalists. You obviously, Spencer Ackerman, James Bamford, Laura Poitras, Chris Hedges, really smart, good people who have done phenomenal reporting over the years. But they are people who oftentimes buck mainstream trends, right? It's not Charlie Savage, the New York Times isn't on it. It's not, the Washington Post TikTok reporter who writes stories about how people who suggest that the Hannibal Doctrine might be real are the modern equivalent of Holocaust deniers. We didn't get them, and I don't want to demean the people we have on, because if you look at the actual journalism, people like Spencer Ackerman, people like James Bamford, people like Laura Poitras have actually done, it's an incredible body of work. The Snowden revelations, multiple people involved in the Snowden revelations. Bamford wrote the first book on the NSA. The government tried to prosecute him for writing a book about the NSA. No one had ever done so before. It's like really good national security journalists who have pushed these stories and whom we actually know something about. But I think the Washington Post and the New York Times journalists should be utterly ashamed of themselves But I mean, this is Project Censored. Everyone agrees with me on that one. That's not exact. I mean, that's their whole reason for existing, that these people are shameful mouthpieces of the military industrial complex.
Well, and I think it
But
also
that's
shows the difference between journalists and, stenographers for the State Department.
yeah.
Journalists are people who don't listen to what they're told by the powers that be, that this is what you cover, this is how you cover it, these are the words you're allowed to use. Journalists are the people who go out there themselves and get the story, but that's not who works at the New York Times or CNN or whatever.
Some of these people have had mainstream backgrounds, right? I mean, Spencer Ackerman and Bamford have published for publications that would never publish me. But I think these days they're frequently in, The Nation and stuff like that. Because if you start questioning what Israel's doing, there's a limited number of places that will talk to you. But so like it's not like they're fringe figures. I mean, I think many people would celebrate Spencer Ackerman and James Bamford. You know, people hated I.F. Stone when he was alive. They attacked him all the time, and now every corporate apologist for the military-industrial complex talks about how much they love I.F. Stone. I actually had a terrible writing professor. I shouldn't say this. In this college program I did, who worked for the New York Times and would like try to edit my pieces and be like, you have to remove the reference that the settlements are illegal and things like that. And he's like, yeah, I was so inspired by I.F. Stone. He led me to what I was doing. But then I bought his complete works, and I was so disappointed by what he had written. He was basically the first blogger, bringing down the gatekeeping of our prestigious organizations to keep like, wow, wow. But many other people don't read in the corporate media, so they'll praise an I.F. Stone occasionally, even though when he was alive, he had to write a newsletter because he was blacklisted, and everybody said he was a conspiracy crank.
I mean, that's the same with people. People loved on the right wing, or even just the Democrats, loved to quote MLK Jr., but not like his letter from Birmingham jail or anything. It's like it's like these out of context quotes that just sound nice and flowery in the moment. But which is of course how we do history in this country.
Look at Dan Ellsberg, right? The Nixon administration called him the most dangerous man in America. People hated him. They hunted him. They broke into psychiatrist's office. He was a reviled figure. And then, 30 years, 40 years later, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden come out. And what do all the same sorts of people who want to send Ellsberg to jail come out and say, they didn't do it like Ellsberg did. There are no Ellsbergs at all. And, Dan Ellsberg, rest his soul, was alive then and was just sitting there being like, this is exactly what I did, and this is exactly how you reacted to it. What are you talking about?
You
Or the
goldfish.
other surreal thing I went to was, the FBI counterintelligence program was revealed because a group of anti-war activists broke in to the FBI office and stole the documents. Like on the 40th anniversary, they came forward and they brought them to Congress. And I was at Congress while everyone was like applauding them and talking about how brave they were and how great they were. And this is in the midst of the Snowden thing. So you probably have people who are like, let's jail Snowden, let's jail Snowden. And at the same time, like, And when they did that, they sent it to members of Congress. The members of Congress sent it back and condemned them because you can't steal documents. And all of the newspaper reporters, except for Betty Metzger at the Washington Post, sent the documents back too, right? But now they're heroes. Whereas at the time, everyone's like, no, you can't publish documents from people breaking into the FBI building. But yeah, this does show mass surveillance of the African-American community. And yeah, it does show a plot to disrupt the anti-war movement, but you can't do this.
Yeah.
So, that's journalism for you.
Isn't it just? Well, Chip, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and talk about this important topic. Where's the best way for folks, or best place for folks, to stay up to date on the work that you do?
So I have to recommend you visit the Defending Rights and Dissent website, rightsanddissent.org. Defending Rights and Dissent is also on Twitter. I will not call it X, @RightsDissent. And I am unfortunately still on Twitter. at Chip Gibbons 89. Every day when I look at the things Elon Musk has put in my For You column, I think, why am I still here? I never liked Twitter. I always just get people being like, you look pretty ugly and stupid. And it's like, okay, you have an anime picture of yourself. So, but yes, the hellhole that is Twitter. Can I say that? Is that a George Carlin word? The hellhole that is Twitter is still where I'm at. Probably be there for the rest of my life. It's very much like Sartre's No Exit. Hell is Twitter and you're trapped there.
I can relate. We use the tools that we have, even if we don't like them. Chip, thank you again so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.